what we find ourselves here in chapter 24 is the beginning of Jesus' fifth and final major teaching that he's going to give to the disciples. And this one is referred to as the Olivet Discourse because it happens on the Mountain of Olives. A lot of important things are going to happen there. But what we're going to see is that Jesus is going to focus on the end times, right? The end times and the events that are going to play out towards the end of the age. And although there is lots of debate about the timing of these events and how they're going to play out and what that's going to look like practically, and people don't necessarily all agree, shocker, right? But as I was preparing for this, I kept having to remind myself of, shout out to Pastor Todd at Calvary Sunrise in Marietta. This was one of our core values from 2 Timothy 3:16-7. It says, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. And so no matter how difficult some of these passages are to understand and to really grasp a full understanding of it, they can and should still be used as application to push us and point us to Christ to live a better life. I also believe that there's not really a reason why you should be, and it's not realistic, I should say, I guess, that you are 100% set in your complete understanding of the Bible, right? That's just not realistic. It's going to change as you grow older, as you mature, as you read it more. And I think of Chuck Smith. We at Bible college, we'd have to read or listen to Chuck tracts, and that was listening to him teach through the entire Bible. So it started with Genesis, and then it ended in Revelation. We had to listen to the entire thing. It's not a cult, I promise. You had to do that, you know. It sounds weird when you say it. You had to listen to your leader teach through the Bible entirely over 2 years, but it's not. And we had this class, but his sermons were over a longer period of time. So when he taught Genesis, might have been, not, and when he taught Revelation and stuff, it was far apart. And so it was interesting because you would listen to him, and we were listening to him, like I said, within a 2-year time frame. So you had a pretty good idea of what you heard him say in the other books. And so we'd get to things, and he'd say one thing, and then, a month later, he'd be talking about the same topic, and he'd be like, oh, I used to believe this, but I actually now believe this. And then he'd get to another topic and goes, well, now I actually believe this. And it's very common for this to be the case with things like this that aren't specific and aren't laid out clear to us, that's a reality that we face. And so I don't think there's any reason why we should pressure ourselves into saying I have to have this perfect view set in stone or else. It's as you're growing and as you're learning more, there are times that you're going to change. I still don't even fully know what I believe in certain things. I flipped like 7 times this week. And this morning I flipped like 8 more. And so all that matters is that we take what the Word says, we apply it to our lives. And also, I think it's important to note that doesn't give us the permission to read these things and be like, well, that doesn't matter for me, right? It absolutely does matter. You should know where you stand on certain difficult chapters and things in the Bible, but we can never let it get in the way of our fellowship, right? It's regardless of when you believe these things are going to happen, it should never get in the way of our fellowship with one another. And so, with all that out of the way, Jesus, in chapter 23, he did what? He finished rebuking the religious leaders for their wickedness and for setting his temple up and his house to be what? A den of thieves. And so he has just finished destroying them and saying how evil they are and wicked and all this just bad things. And now we see him leaving the temple, leaving the religious leaders, and we know that this is actually, in reality, the last time. It's Jesus walking away from them for good. And what a sobering thought to think that there was a time where Jesus said, I'm done. I'm done with you religious leaders. And I think that's sobering for a few reasons, because we also see that happen with the Egyptians in certain times, and the pharaohs, where God says, all right, You've hardened your heart. Enough is enough. And that's essentially what's happening now. And so let's look at verse 1 through 3. It says here in chapter 24, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down.' Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age.'" And so I kind of imagine, who's ever been mad at their kid? Or whoever's been frustrated with friends, right? And when someone's frustrated, you can tell, right? And if you have kids, at least Ezra is like this. He's a people pleaser. How many people know a people pleaser, right? And what do? When you see somebody angry, you kind of go over to them and try to talk to them and like soften it up, right? And you're like, "Hey, I did the dishes for you. Like, don't you see my clothes? My bed is made though." Right? And that's kind of how I view the disciples here as they see Jesus walking away. He's just yelled at these religious leaders, and the disciples are like, "Hey, Jesus, but look how beautiful the temple is. Look how gorgeous this building was." And we know that historically it was a very beautiful building. When it was rebuilt, after Ezra rebuilt it, it was rebuilt again. And this time Herod, he had it built up to be this beautiful, amazing thing. It was the biggest temple that was ever built in Israel's history, and it was covered in gold, right? So when you would look at it, the gold was so pure and everything was so covered that it would blind you just by looking at it. And areas that weren't covered in gold were these just perfect, precious blocks of marble that were so pure and so white that from a distance it would look like snow on top of the temple, right? And it was the big, just beautiful thing, right? It was considered of its time one of the, and if it was still around, it would most definitely be considered one of the great wonders of the world. It was beautiful. It was something to behold, right? And so for them to say that's natural. Look how pretty this is. Look how beautiful your temple is. And then for Jesus to react the way he does, it would have been a bombshell. It would have been shocking. He says, "Do you not see? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another." And not even would that have been shocking from just like, wow, he just said that the temple's going to be destroyed. Like this is how they thought Jesus was coming and he was going to take the throne right then and there. So not only would it have been shocking for them in that sense of like, wait, if the temple is going to be destroyed, how are you going to be king? So it would have been shocking from that standpoint, but it would have also been like, well, these are some really big stones. These are some big stones. How on earth are these going to be removed? But we know that about 40 years later, in 70 AD, this actually happened. The Romans came into town, and there were some Jewish rebels that were rebelling against Rome, and they were doing well. And then we know that they eventually surrounded Jerusalem, and everyone ran into the temple, and that's kind of where they hid. And we know is that I believe it was Titus, the king at the time, didn't want to destroy the temple, and that's what he commanded his soldiers not to do. Don't destroy the temple because it's so beautiful. But one drunk soldier accidentally purposely threw a torch and lit the place ablaze. And what happened is that historically it's taught that the gold then melted down into the cracks, right? So the fire got so hot that it melted the gold, and the gold fell into the cracks. And at that point, it was no longer beautiful. And so they had the temple removed stone by stone so that they could get the gold out. Right? And they did such a thorough job of removing that temple stone by stone that today archaeologists have a really tough time of pinpointing exactly where the temple laid at one point because it was completely removed. And so we see that this first prophecy that Jesus gave actually came to happen, right? That the temple was destroyed. And I think that the application for us, going off based on chapter 23, right, is how he was rebuking the Pharisees for what? For being hypocritical, for caring about the outward appearance and how they looked in front of men instead of inwardly what was happening. See, Jesus was ushering out an old way of doing things, and he was attempting and beginning to teach the disciples and usher in the gospel age, the church age, where outward beauty that lacked inward change is worthless. That's essentially what Jesus is putting the nail in the coffin in that point to the disciples that, hey, this outward beauty that you guys seek, that you think is so good, it is nothing if there is not inward change. And what do we know about the gospel? The gospel, if truly received, creates an inward change in our lives. The gospel is what changes people's lives. And so one thing that I always try to remind the kids is that, hey, like, it's great that we have 80, 90 kids. That's awesome. It really is. But we got to focus on how can we get the gospel to them? How can we get that to their hearts? Because if we go around just saying, yeah, we have a club of 80, 90 kids, like, okay, cool. But do you teach the word? Is the gospel going forth? Are the kids' lives being changed? Because if they're not, then to God, it's nothing. It's just religion. It's just checking off a box. It is nothing to him. God is more concerned about the inward purity of our hearts and allowing the gospel to change us than what we say and how we act outwardly, right? Because he knows that if the gospel has changed your life, guess what? You're going to act different on the outside. You're going to hold yourself different. You're going to be different compared to the rest of the world. Because that's what the gospel does, is it changes us, it grows us. And so after Jesus drops this bombshell on them, in verse 3, they ask a very logical, for them, it's one of the times where it's like, okay, that's fair, disciples. Like, that's a good question to ask, is when are these things going to happen? You say that the temple's going to be destroyed, because again, we have to remember that for them, they were like, man, Jesus is going to, he right now, he's about to be in glory here, and his kingdom's going to be on the earth right now. That's what they were thinking in their mind. So they're like, well, that kind of throws a little wrinkle in our plans and our thoughts. So when are these things going to happen? What is going to be the timeline? And this next section of scripture is where, the believers start to disagree on things. And I couldn't help but, when I was studying, find myself asking this question of like, why didn't Jesus make it more clear? Why didn't he just come out? Wouldn't it be so much easier if Jesus was just like, this is when I'm going to return, right? And it's I think it's a logical, fair-ish question. I mean, not really, but, fair enough. And I think that the one main reason is that God desires that all generations are ready for his second coming. And a way I read it this week that was really, really helpful to me is that we shouldn't look at the second coming of Christ and the rapture of the church and all that stuff as an event that's happening on a timeline, like as a point that's happening, but something that ever since Jesus went up into heaven that we have been running alongside, right? And that at some point in history we're going to intersect that time. And so that for me was really helpful to kind of have a better understanding of. I was like, oh, that's really cool. I was like, if I just say that without saying I read that from somebody, they'll definitely know that I read that from somebody. So I didn't come up with that, but that was how it was. I read it and I was like, that's really, really helpful. And so what we are going to see in this next section in verse 4 through 8 is the end times regarding the nations in a very general sense. It says in verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. A little side note that I thought was interesting, again, something I read, is that it wasn't until, if you want kind of more proof, I guess you say, that Jesus was who he said he was, is we didn't really see any fake Christ come onto the scene until after Jesus did. And so usually that counterfeit doesn't come until the real thing has already shown up. So I just thought that was something cool. I was like, I think I want to share that, because that's kind of encouraging, right? As a way, again, to bolster your faith in Jesus as Christ. But the first section here, Jesus gives kind of 5 things that the world can expect to see as we approach and as time goes on. And it's false teachers, wars, famine, disease, pestilences, disease, and earthquakes or, natural disasters. And so these things, interestingly enough, are themselves not signs that the end is near. So we don't look at wars happening in our world and go, oh, the end time is coming, right? We don't look at earthquakes, all these bad things. What Jesus is saying is, hey, these things must happen as time goes on. And he describes them as birth pains, is essentially what he says. The beginning of sorrows. In other Bibles, it's referred to as birth pains. And the idea is that as we get closer to the second coming of Christ, what's going to happen? These things will become more frequent. And there will be less time in between them, just like childbirth, right? Just like labor. They're like labor pains. And so these things, although they themselves are not signs specifically of his coming, they are signs that the end is near. And we see in verse 6, I think it's really important for us to look at this. It says, see that you are not troubled. These things must come to pass. These things must happen. And so, even though we can expect these things, God's desire is not for us to look at these events and start to fear, right? And start to worry about them. But we are to look at these events and say, these things are coming. And as God's church, it should give us more of a sense of urgency, if you will, to see the gospel spread throughout our community, right? It's not that we should also ignore them and be like, oh, that's just whatever. Like you said, then the end times, whatever, I'll probably be dead when it happens. That's not a good view of it either, because God desires us to be a light to the world. And if we are sitting around not doing anything, right, what good does that make? What good is that? What good is a lighthouse without a light? Right? They don't make noises. They have lights. That's what they do. And if the lighthouse has no light, then where do we go from there? What are we doing as the church? And so we should take these things and view them as, okay, Christ is returning soon. And we're aware of it, and we don't fear it, but we use that and we say, okay, in light of these things, we need to preach the gospel. We need to disciple people. We need to pray with our community. We need to be there. We need to love. We need to, right? We need to be the church that God has called us to be. It's not easy when we read some of these things it's hard to not be fearful of them. And unfortunately, as we're going to see in verse 9, verse 10, is that 11. It's verse 11. We'll get there eventually. That there's going to be lots of people that unfortunately have used end times prophecy to deceive lots of people. It was like 1944, I think, one of the biggest ones that happened. And I mean, it was just awful. And these people take this out of context and these things and say, oh, because of this, look, we got to do this. Most cult-like groups that have formed and these evil people who are taking advantage of happened because they were out and they took these signs and they twisted them and they changed the narrative to fit what they wanted to fit. And it led a lot of people to stray and it caused a lot of pain. And so in verse 9 it says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." This verse, I believe, is speaking to after the church has been raptured, and you can, again, this is the part where you can disagree with me and it's okay, right? We can still have tacos afterwards. But I believe personally that this is referring to after the church has been raptured and the new Jewish believers who we know are going to emerge because of the two witnesses in Revelation and the angel there, that group of people in the tribulation period is who this is talking about. That's what I believe. All right? And so, what's going to happen in that time period? Well, it's a lot of bad things, right? I read this and it feels chaotic to me, right? That's just the feeling I get. It's just mass chaos, like something we've never felt before. And I think that's also the reality that can kind of help give us a little bit of hope right now, is that it's like oftentimes like, man, the times are bad right now. Times are rough. Gas is like $5, and I read this and I go, well, I mean, $5 or be martyred. Like $5 for gas, like it's rough. Yes, sure. Times are hard. But it's nothing compared to the chaos that will come during the tribulation. And that's why I personally hope to be raptured before it. Right? So, anybody want to join me on that? You're good to go. But what we know from this is that even in this chaos and this time of, it's just so sad, this time of lewdness and the love of many will grow cold. Right? That makes me sad, that thinking of that the church, like that I don't ever want the church to become like that either, right? And I think the application here is also a warning to us as Christians of allowing our love for people to grow cold, right? And it's like, oh, well, they think differently than me. I don't want to share the gospel with them because they're going to vote for someone differently than me. That's what I view and think of when I read of the love of God growing cold in our lives, to where other things are more important than us showing love to people in our community. Right? There's a lot of people in our community, in our world, that are hurting, and the question is, how is the church going to respond to them? How are we going to show our love to them? Or are we not going to? Are we going to grow cold and just allow us to be like, oh, no, not those people? Right? And who does that sound like? That sounds like the religious leaders. And that's the whole thing that I believe that Jesus is trying to do, is he's trying to show us that, hey, we have to stay away from this. The gospel age that is coming, that we are living in right now, the church age, we must stay away from this idea that the religious leaders had, where it was beauty on the outside and just wickedness, evil in the inside. And if we're not careful, we can become that too. The church has the ability to fall into a time of being cold on the inside. All right? And we know it's going to happen. Paul or John sends these letters and to churches of losing their first love, and it's sad that some churches might fall into that. And for us here in Angels Camp, or if you're visiting and wherever church you're from, my prayer is that we don't fall into that category, right? That even though we don't agree with people, we know that their lifestyle is bad and evil and wicked and the things that we're doing, that we still have compassion. That we don't allow it to grow cold. I think that the most important thing in all of this verse is that even in the midst of this chaos that is happening in the tribulation period, in verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. So I believe that even in the most chaotic time in human history, that we have nothing to compare it to now, but the wickedness and evil that we are living in now, and even more so in that evil time, even in a time like that, what is God still going to do? He's still going to preach his gospel to the world. Even in that time, he is still going to try and save as many people as he can. As many as he can. Unfortunately, a lot of them are going to fall away and be deceived, but he's still going to do that. And I mean, what great application for us. We live in in our minds, very chaotic time right now. Right? There is a lot of people, and some of you in this room, and so I'm not sorry, but that think that come the election, it's gonna go crazy, and it's gonna be mass chaos, and it might be, and things are gonna be tough, and it's gonna be hard for certain people, and it doesn't matter who gets picked. There's gonna be a lot of people angry. There's gonna be a lot of people mad. It literally does not matter. And regardless of that, the question that I believe Jesus wants us to examine today is, what are you going to do in the midst of that chaos? In the midst of the chaos that is coming and that we are living in right now, although nothing compared to the tribulation, what are you going to do about it as the church? Are you going to be cold? Are you going to have your hearts shut to those people that are living different lives? Or are you going to be preaching the gospel to the world? And I think the important thing to note, and I'm reminded, if you haven't seen the movie, go watch Jesus Revolution. It's a great movie. But Chuck was his most famous quote and thing that ever happened was when he had hippies in his church and they were like, oh, they're going to get the carpet dirty. And Chuck said, well, then we'll rip it out. We'll rip it out, because to have them there was more value than carpet. Right? That's what Jesus is trying to communicate here, I believe, is that the people in your time the people that we face that don't agree with us, that live their life differently, things that we would look at and be like, that is just an abomination to the Lord. That is just gross to live your life like that. That, yes, that might be true, but God still loves them. God still wants to change them. That they are not less than because of that God still wants to love them. And it starts with inward change. It starts with the gospel being preached and going out and touching their lives. And guess what? And then eventually the outward stuff will change. It's not going to happen right away. Sanctification is a process, right? It's not easy. It doesn't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden people are perfect. It's a process that happens over the entire course of our life. And so I would say that what God wants you guys to know today is that regardless of the chaos, regardless of that, your mission, the church's mission as a whole today, is to go and preach the gospel, to be a light to your neighbors, to be a light to the people in your community, to not allow the chaos of this world to turn you cold, to not allow the chaos and the evilness in this world to have you being some beautiful outward temple, but really on the inside, it's just cold. That's what God wants us to do. He doesn't want us to be like the Pharisees, and Jesus was ushering out that old way of doing that and ushering in a beautiful new way. And we do that by reading our Bible, by praying, by discipling, by fellowshipping, by doing all those things. We let the Word of God transform us from the inside first, daily. Right? It's not something that he said you're going to just wake up one day and be perfect, but we read the Bible daily. And there's times when you don't want to. It's tough. It's hard. But you get up and you do it anyway, and it's almost always those times that I can just feel my heart softening, like, okay, I feel better. It's like drinking a morning cup of coffee. That's what it's like on days you're grumpy, and it's like, okay, and letting the Word soften my heart, letting it pierce my heart and warm me up so that I can go out and do the things that God has called me to do.